first of all, welcome to everybody to this book presentation of Introduction to Advanced Urban Segregation by Professor Sako Musterd from the University of Amsterdam. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here. It's the first hot off the press presentation of this year. Hot off the press presentations are webinars about newly published books which are relevant to urban studies at a global level. And today we have with us Professor Sako Musterd from the University of Amsterdam. I'm very pleased to welcome him also, because we have been knowing each other for several decades, since Urbex, which is already quite some year ago. It was a large framework for research program by the European Commission on urban segregation, by the way. And it all started there. And I guess Sako was working on this topic since even before that, for quite some time. As far as I remember, actually, I will now briefly present the three speakers today, and then I will leave the floor to them, to the presentations, and then we will have an open discussion with everybody, both online and in presence. It's more than 100 people, so I'm very happy that we are trying this hybrid way of dealing with the situation. That's why it was a bit technically challenged at the very beginning. Currently, Professor Sako Musterd is emeritus at the University of Amsterdam, and he was a professor of urban geography. Actually, once a professor in urban geography, always a professor in urban geography. He published very extensively on this topic, more than 500 scientific contributions, nearly 30 books on strongly related topics to segregation, also on all these aspects, so spatial segregation, school segregation, whatever kind of segregation you think of, he is an expert of. And actually, I would like to remind one book which impressed me a lot when we still didn't know each other, which I think gave a very important contribution to the debate on social policies and the relationship between social policies and segregation, which was the book you edited with Wim Ostendorf in 1998, which is Urban Segregation and the Welfare State, Inequality, Exclusion in Western Cities, which I think was one of the very first books which addressed the role of the welfare state in spatial terms. There were very few at that time, and this was one of the first, and I think it was a path-breaking contribution to the debate. It's not your most cited book, but it's one of the most cited ones, definitely. Okay, the book will be discussed. I stop because it's too long to praise all your achievements in your career. The book is discussed by by Costanzo Ranci and by Szymon Marcińczak. I hope I pronounce it correctly, or almost correctly. Costanzo Ranci is professor of sociology at the Politecnico di Milano in Italy. And is a sociology working actually amongst planners and people working, planning the city. So he's quite aware of a spatial dimension of segregation processes. And he worked a lot also on school segregation, and actually also together with Sako Musterd on that topic, and the importance of segregation in educational processes. The other colleague and friend is Szymon Marcińczak from the University of Łódź. I hope I pronounced that also correctly or closely, in Poland. He's an urban geographer working also on segregation in European cities. So we are confined on Europe now. So we are not considering segregation process globally. In the global south, it's different dynamic taking place. He's a hardcore quantitative scholar and has a very deep knowledge about issues and mechanisms of segregation. I will switch off this, sorry. It's because I wanted to solve these problems. And so he has a wide knowledge also in methodological terms on how to identify both the processes of segregation, but also the drivers behind the processes. So it's a real pleasure to give you the floor, Sako. You will have half an hour, 40 minutes for the presentation. Then we will have around 10 minutes for each of the discussants. Then Sako will have a short window of time to reply to the discussions and comments made by Costanzo and Szymon, and then we will open up the discussion to every participant. Okay, thanks a lot, and the floor is yours, Sako.
Of course, what the first question you have to ask if you present an advanced introduction to urban segregation, what is advanced to it? I think, at least to me, the advanced element in this introduction is in the three concepts that you find on the left side of this slide, which is new perspectives, I hope, some extra reflections on all aspects of segregation, and the challenges to come. So these are the three key concepts in the advanced introduction, in my view. So I try to pay more attention to let's say, additional dimensions of segregation, domains of segregation, but also in terms of theory, try to, let's say, do a bit different things compared to what has happened in the literature so far. So I will come back to that. But also in terms of methodology, use of data, approaches to urban segregation, to come up with a couple of things that are not quite common so far, I think. And the same to policies. What I try to do is to look at policies from different perspectives as well. And so we can reflect on that and also define some new challenges that come from that. So this is approximately what I would like to do. Well, this is what I said. I have 8 different topics. Some of them will only be touched upon very briefly, and others I will go into a bit more detail. So these are the topics that I would like to address. So you see that I want to talk about dimensions and domains. I will do that very briefly. I think I have to say something about levels of segregation, especially in the European context where we are now in, and so what that implies. Theoretical perspectives, fourth topic, methodological innovations briefly, and then also I would like to talk about not just about understanding urban segregation, but also about effects of segregation, which is quite a separate stream of literature, you could say. Policies that are quite common at the moment, and then challenges. So this is the order of what I would like to talk about in 30 minutes. First, the dimensions. So you will know quite a few dimensions that have been dealt with in segregation studies, especially the race and class dimensions have received a lot of attention. I think that's good. And actually, at the moment, there are also quite some studies that are paying specific attention to both at the same time, so race and class, which is even better, I think, because that is needed to understand both the race and the class separately, but also in combination. Because there are dynamics in the segregation realm across the globe. For example, there seems to be some reduction of segregation of migrants, or segregation of blacks, even black people, even. But there is at the same time a condensation, you could almost say, in terms of the relationship between race and class. So you could say the segregation level in terms of race, between brackets, is reducing a little bit, but the composition of that race segregation has become much more homogeneous in terms of class. So you see more poverty in the remaining race segregation, so to say. And so that requires a lot of attention, I think, but also other dimensions should be studied because they play a big role in the segregation process as well. And so I mentioned here level of education, lifestyles, age, household types, and whatever you can think about. So there are other dimensions of segregation which are also playing a big role in the spatial outcome of other segregations as well. So they are also not completely disconnected from each other as well. So there is an importance to study also the other dimensions. For example, one of these dimensions is the age segregation, which was receiving more attention some decades ago, but it kind of disappeared over the decades. And I think that might not be a good development, because there are certain social processes which are really relevant, which are connected to that age segregation as well. So the simplest one and most direct one is obviously the potential clash between generations that can pop up suddenly or disappear suddenly as well. So therefore it helps to look at these kind of dimensions as well. This is an example of Amsterdam, where you see the elderly or really older people in connection with the very young children in particular, and so you can detect possibly places where there might result some conflict in society. Apart from dimensions, you also have to consider, in my view, more domains. So there are a lot of domains. I just mentioned a few, but we are used to pay attention to residential and school segregation, but segregation is everywhere, you could say, and so you might have thought that in some domains segregation levels would not be that high or that clear, but researchers that have done work on workplace segregation, for example, or means of transport use, also leisure activities, they appear to be quite segregated as well. So segregation is much more a societal thing than just related to residential and school contexts. And so I can give you a couple of examples here as well, based on research sometimes where I was involved in, sometimes others were involved in that. But for example, the residential segregation of socioeconomic class and country combined, country of origin combined, so the race and class combined classification was used in this example, where we found that especially higher income natives, so local natives, I could say, compared to other categories, were sorry, I have to take that up a bit. Higher income natives compared to other combinations of country of origin and income category, they are the most frequently disaffiliated from the rest of the population, the most segregated, you could say. And sometimes we have called that even cocooning, because they were doing that in the research project that we have carried out. They were segregating as individuals also clearly in all of these areas simultaneously. So they were trying to create homogeneous residential environments, but also to find workplace environments that were segregated in a similar way. And also their mobility behavior was like that. And so this is just an example of it. Low income natives actually are not disappearing, so they are still very segregated in homogeneous neighborhoods, even more so than high income natives. But the relationship between segregation in the residential domain and these other domains was a bit weaker for that low income category. As an example, I mentioned the sources that I refer to in the slides, and so you can have a look at it later on if you like. This will be available, I guess. There is also a lot of research, and I think it's also very interesting research, where school segregation is the core issue, and but this is not unrelated to residential segregation. So we have done a quite big project with the people that are mentioned here, and made and produced a special issue of Urban Studies in this field, and also figured out that residential segregation is clearly one of the key indicators, the key factors also creating school segregation. And so there are also other factors that create school segregation, and we have called that the factors that are combined in the educational landscape. This is about how the schools are funded, or whether they are public or private, how parents are involved, and so on, or what the pedagogical climate in the school is. But the residential segregation is a really a key factor. And we had thought that this would not be the case, especially in contexts where there is a lot of school choice, free school choice present. Like in the Netherlands is one of the examples where people, parents and children have, on paper at least, free school choice, so they can go where they want. And so this would not need a certain residential pattern that is related to a certain school choice. But even in these highly school choice based contexts, school segregation was still very strongly impacted on by the residential patterns. And so this is an interesting field of research. I think if you would like to dig deeper into that school arena. We also have looked at school and neighborhood effects in various research projects. Brooks Sykes has done a PhD on that a decade ago or so. And but this is also interesting to see how strong these school and neighborhood effects have impact on educational achievements. So the school is important, but the neighborhood as well. Actually, they are very difficult to disentangle in many cases, but in some cases you can do that. And the conclusion was that both are firmly having a relation with the educational achievement. I can't go into the deep, so this is just a taste of what is also in the volume. But I will quickly continue with talking a little bit about the levels and the dynamics of segregation in European context. I think that's important because there is a lot of myth here in that area, always has been there, and a lot of people working on segregation issues always talk about increasing segregation. That's not generally true. So it depends a little bit on what kind of dimensions of segregation you look at. But my overall rather general conclusion so far, at the moment at least, is that what we see at the moment is that, and especially in Europe, but also elsewhere, I would say, is that the segregation levels based on country of origin or related kind of indicators, that they are they have moderate levels, moderately high levels, I could say, in most of the cities, but they are decreasing, and they are especially decreasing in the course of time. So after a certain initial peak in segregation has been reached, especially with new migration processes, for example. After a period, then they start to decrease, and that is also related to be expected integration processes, of course. Although not everybody is believing in that, in reality, it works like that. You can also see it in terms of other integration indicators. So that is related to the country of origin or related indicators. Socioeconomic segregation used to be much lower in most of the European countries, but that is clearly increasing, and that is related to other processes. It's more related to welfare state or welfare regime changes in many countries across the globe, getting more liberal and creating conditions that are stimulating inequality in a way, and as a follow-up of that stimulated inequality, you also see increasing socioeconomic segregation. I gave you the example of Amsterdam here, but it can also have another example. Stockholm, in this case, is clearly showing what is happening in many cities, actually in Europe as well. So the left-hand side with the green arrows is an index of segregation, the similarity index, saying something about the level of segregation between Western and natives and non-Western, very crude categories in this case, but then also subdivided between different income categories. And you can see that the segregation between these two origin types of segregation is clearly decreasing, and also in each of the distinguished income categories. I just took the extremes, the first and the last quintiles, income quintiles, but you can see that segregation levels are clearly decreasing in both of these income quintiles. If you look at the segregation in socioeconomic terms, the right-hand side of the slide, then you see the difference between low and high, so the segregation levels, and they're also done separately for non-Western and for natives. And you can see increases, and this is a more general thing. I'm not saying that this is exactly happening everywhere, but it is quite a general process going on at the moment in many cities across the globe, actually, especially the right-hand side things. Okay, after presenting a little bit about the dynamics and the levels of segregation, I think you always have to start with that more extensively before you start digging into the causes or the understanding. But now, well, I would like to say a bit about these theoretical perspectives that in my view are really relevant to understand the certain levels of segregations. And we can reflect upon that a bit. I would like to look at three factors in particular. And so the first is the institutional context. Yuri already said that I worked on that already for a long period of time. So I think it was, we had organized a big conference in 1994 in Amsterdam, where we actually started to focus on that welfare state context as a potentially very important factor explaining levels of segregation. And that was in the wake of the discussion about polarized cities that Saskia Sassen in particular brought to the fore. But then we noticed in Amsterdam, at least, we noticed that the welfare regime context was not very much in the picture, so to say, and decided to organize a conference on that. And so that resulted in that book, Urban Segregation and the Welfare State. And from then on, the institutional context did not disappear in my work anymore, because we figured out that it is indeed a very important set of factors. In fact, the institutional context, how it is organized and arranged, playing a big role in understanding levels of segregation. I will come back to that, but it's not the only one. There are, of course, also structural factors like the economic structure of cities and urban regions, so the connectedness in global arena, but also other structural conditions that have been grown over the decades, over the years, over the centuries, even certain cultural traits in cities and urban regions, and so on. So that's also important to take into account for if you want to have a full understanding. And I've experienced that in certain decades, it was actually not done to take all of these different dimensions together as explaining factors. So there were eras where you only focused on institutional context or only on structural factors. But more recently, I would say last decade or so in particular, more and more people have combined these three that I mentioned here, 3 dimensions, 3 factors in the understanding. So also individual behavior and exposure to environment is nowadays not regarded to be completely driven by institutional and structural context, but also people believe that there is also some autonomy in individual behavior and exposure to environments, preferences in particular. Of course, there are also constraints. So individual behavior is not just choice. It can also be a result of having no choice, of limited choice. So then we talk about constraints. But it makes sense, in my view, to try to deal with these 3 factors simultaneously if you want to understand segregation more broadly. I have applied it here well, in my examples in the book. Also, sometimes I focus a bit more on residential domain, but a lot of these things can also be applied to other domains. I'm sure about that. When I talk about the institutional context, you can, of course, talk about a lot of things, a lot of institutional context that have been derived from the welfare regimes, for example. But here I just, because of time, I just focus on the welfare regimes. If you want to make a distinction between different welfare regimes, I think Esping Anderson is the one to read. And so he was the first that put it clearly, I think, brought it clearly together, although there were a lot of other people working on welfare regimes way before Esping Anderson came with his work, but he did it in a very concise and accessible way. You can easily distinguish between states on the basis of how they cope with their populations in terms of all kind of services and all kind of facilities that are important for their lives, and especially social security, for example, or benefit systems in all domains like unemployment benefits or pensions for the elderly, disability benefits, and so on. The right to housing, the level of decommodification of housing or other issues for that matter, the health system, the availability of the health system. These are all differing between states, and that is connected to the welfare regime that they have in fact developed. And and if you look at that in more detail and you see what they do, you can also see connections with levels of stratification between these different states that are connected to the way they deal with these factors that I mentioned in the left-hand column. Then it is not a difficult step to talk about different type of welfare, running from rudimentary via residual to extensive and universal. So you will, if you read Esping Anderson, he also classified states in that respect. Of course, you will have to continue doing that because states are moving between welfare regimes to some extent. So they move up from one type to another type sometimes, and then of course they get into another category. What is important is that you can connect this also to debates about neoliberalization or social democracy or whatever kind of political distinctions you want to connect to it. This is also connected to these type of policies. Also, corporatist policies you can find a way to position them in these kind of classifications. I put a question mark because I noticed that over the last 2 decades or so, 3 decades, there is a clear shift going on into neoliberal regimes, and so they tend to pop up almost everywhere. And also, what used to be universal welfare states now also are increasingly getting neoliberal characters, and so they move up a little bit. So that's the reason why I put a question mark here. But what is important here as well is that it's related, all of this is related to the level of inequality that will develop. And roughly speaking, inequality is running from high to low, from left to right in this scheme. And that has also implications for segregation, because segregation levels are highly related to social inequality levels in general as well. These different levels of inequality, if you want to dig into that a bit more deeply, you can use a lot of indicators for that. The Gini coefficient has become a very important indicator for income inequality. And so I give you here some examples of the level of the Gini coefficient in different states, and also have put next to it the level of the top 10% and the bottom 10% of the income earners. For example, the 22.3 figure that is here in the graph, it says that in South Africa, the 10% is earning 22.3 times as much as the bottom 10% in terms of income. And China is also highly unequal. As you can see, Brazil is very unequal. The US still also double as unequal compared to the lower end of this graph. These inequalities, they go hand in hand with segregation levels. Even though there is a delay, always a delay in terms of the inequality that is rising, sometimes inequalities are coming up very quickly, like in China, but also in Eastern European countries, for example, when with the fall of the Iron Curtain, then also inequality rapidly came up really very fast. In a few years, the inequality level was very high already, but segregation levels then come with a delay. So after 10 years or so, you see the effects in the segregation level. That is because it is, of course, it has to be, the system has to be rearranged, and building neighborhoods takes time, moving takes time, and so on. Well, I had in this graph the the Lorenz curves that are used to talk about inequality in terms of well, in this time, this in terms of income. You should also look at inequality in terms of wealth, because that's not always running parallel. For example, the Netherlands and Sweden have relatively low levels of income inequality, but the wealth inequality levels are very high, and so you will have to combine these to get a fuller picture. Structural factors. With that, I mean a lot of things I mentioned here. So the embeddedness in global networks, very specific structures you can distinguish. And what works here is that if you are well embedded or not so well embedded in global networks, if you have the capacity as a city or an urban region to attract a lot of firms that operate on a global scale, you get different processes following up. So these typically the well-embedded advanced services sectors and the knowledge-intensive industry cities, they tend to be more liberal, so to say, but also to get a lot of extra neoliberal impulses, because the argument is all the time, so we are now doing very well, but if you don't give us space to operate the way we would like to do, then we can't continue this way, or we have to move, we have to select another country, and so on. So there is a lot of space, a lot of room for the industries that are operating in these contexts, and they are stimulating a kind of neoliberal climate simultaneously, much more than the less embedded and more manufacturing or port-related type of cities are doing. And that has the effect that the first type also creates more inequality, and the second type creates less inequality. And thus, this has effect on the levels of segregation as well. Individual behavior as the third big dimension to study when you want to understand the levels of segregation is about preferences, but also always preferences that are conditioned, first of all, by the institutional and structural context, but also by personal characteristics of the individuals that are involved. And this is, in fact, old stuff that started in the United States with research done, experimental research done by Schelling, who figured out that even if you have only weak preferences for people of your own group in your own environment, that will grow out into a strongly segregated residential situation. If you get the space, the room for maneuver, so to say, if you can do what you want as an individual. But of course, you will have to put this in a context. First of all, in the individual behavior context to start with, because not everybody has the choice and the means to do whatever they want. So this in particular the group, the middle class and the upper class that can do that, but the lower classes not always can do that. So they are left over, you could say, left behind. Some researchers talk about in these terms, and also segregate, but then because they are left behind in a certain environment. But this principle of behavior of the middle class and upper class is rather strong, and I come back to that in a minute. It is strong. We also, if you look at today's societies, and also in societies that are also characterized by strong institutions and favorable structural contexts, then these mechanisms also appear to work. And actually, when I started doing research in this field, I hadn't expected that. I had thought that the stronger welfare states, as we call them, which are more redistributing wealth and taking care of people in all kind of respects, that they would dampen the Schelling's kind of mechanisms very strongly. But that, in fact, turned out not to be the case. Not very strongly, at least, not the way we had thought about it. We started to test the Schelling's ideas and theory, for which he actually got a Nobel Prize in economy in 1971. We started to test that empirically, so we could do that in the last decades because of the availability of much richer data sets, and but then figured out that people are households and individuals, they still prefer to match their own situation to the neighbors that they have. So they try to find a relative homogeneity in their direct environment. And so if you look at these processes nowadays at a large scale empirically, you will find that homogeneity tendency is actually relatively strongly present. Not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. And so we did two studies in particular which underline these findings. For example, one was aimed at you could say the social distance between an individual in terms of income and the social composition of the neighborhood, where we looked at, in this case, at the median neighborhood income, and then figured out, and we looked at the various distances. So, and then looked at the odds to move out of the situation where they were in, and clearly we could find that when these social distances are large, for example, if your own income situation is much below the median income position of your neighborhood, or much above the median income position of the neighborhood, then the probability to move is rising quickly. That is what is shown in this picture. And these are big differences. So so if it's below median and at least 75% below or above median, then you can see that the odds to move are 70% or 80% higher than when it would be approximately the same. In a separate and completely different research project, we took another angle. So we looked at the share of own group living in your own environment. So the share of own group in your own neighborhood. And if that's on the horizontal axis here, and then looked at the probability of the odds to move. And this is all the examples that I give are done on the basis of empirical research on the entire population of countries, Sweden or the Netherlands, in this in these examples. But here we also looked at the share of own group in different dimensions, so the socioeconomic class dimension, for example, or ethnic group, or high level of education, or social cultural classes that you can distinguish. And what we found was that in all cases, the higher the share of own group in your own neighborhood, the lower the odds to move out. So people, we also deduct from this that people are more satisfied with situations where they find more people of their own classes, so to say, in a wider sense. Well, these kinds of theoretical elements you can also apply more widely in research related to segregation. And one of the fields that we have done that recently, which I would like to share with you, because I think it's highly interesting, is the research done on the integration of recent immigrants. Well, this is a hot issue, or a hot potato even, I would say, in many countries across the globe at the moment. You could also start thinking about that in terms of, well, what would be an interesting place to get into the country or to settle in the country and to reach a fuller participation in society. So what is there a relationship between where people enter the country, in what kind of conditions they do that, and their level of integration? And so we started to work on that on a large scale, and so there is, and we were not the only ones. There were a lot of people in social sciences and in economic science that have done research on that. And so what would be important for newcomers to find in the place where they settle when they settle in a new country? What would be important for them to get further in society, specifically in the labor market? Well, there is a lot of research where I call it the port of entry. It was not the asylum seeker centers that I'm talking about, but the first serious place where people were going to live. So after they were allowed to stay in the country where they were going to live. And so the character of the port of entries. And so the one stream of literature was focusing on the share of co-ethnics in these places, because the idea was, if you have a lot of co-ethnics where you enter the country, then they can help you to find your way in the country in all respects. So they can also give you help you to get access to the social system, whatever. Also, finally, you would be helped to find a job, perhaps. Maybe even they can give you a job immediately, which often also happens. Another field was another line of thought was, no, you should actually get into a place where there are a lot of employed residents, because only employed residents will be able to give you access to routes to employment yourself. So that was a reasoning in the literature as well. In both kind of research, actually what the outcomes of these research were not pointing in the same direction. So you had some literature, some research projects gave support to both of these lines of thought. But there were also in both of these lines of thought research projects that kind of came to the conclusion that it didn't work, especially with the co-ethnics, for example. A lot of co-ethnics turned out to be not connected to the labor market themselves, who were already living there, but they couldn't help people very much. Or if they could help them, they would put them in a dead-end job. And so there was the initial job, low wages, doing temporary work, and so on. But it was not a very successful thing. And in terms of the employed residents, there were also research projects that were not pointing in the same direction. And then we thought, well, maybe we should look at a greater detail. And it's just a tiny switch in the research projects. These are actually huge and large-scale research projects working with millions of residents that we followed over time in large-scale longitudinal research, and so that's what turned out to be not dubious, at least in that large-scale research project, was that if you looked at the share of employed co-ethnic. So at the individual level, combined employment and co-ethnics. Then that turned out to be very positively related to the settling of the newcomers. And you had to have the cultural advantage and the employment advantage combined. And that worked out very well in that research project. It also is still true that co-ethnics prefer homogeneity, and like what I talked about earlier, and so they want to live next to co-ethnic, certainly initially because it is familiar, but it only helps if that it helps the integration of people, if that goes together with employment opportunity. There are big research projects as proof of that. I'm aware of time, so I will speed up even more a little bit and skip maybe some of the things that are in the volume. I think methodological innovation, I would briefly like to talk about that because that's an important thing that happened over the last 1.5 decades or so. That innovation should be followed up, I think. So what we find in segregation research, and especially also in the research that looks at the effects of segregation in particular, is that increasingly we moved away as segregation researchers. We are moving away from the so-called fixed area analysis. So the statistical neighborhood, the fixed spatial areas that are compared to each other. So in a lot of classic segregation research, that was quite common, and it's still quite common, I must say. But you see a clear trend away from that, looking more at the individual. So the individual as the center of everything in space, looking at the individual who you can define as an individual, finding him or herself in an environment that has certain characteristics. And so that came up with the rise of longitudinal data and detailed geography, GIS type of geography, micro level analysis, and also measurement tools came up. It has the big advantage that it is not limited to fixed boundary neighborhoods as units of analysis, which was a bit of a statistical thing that created trouble. For example, one of the problems with that was always the so-called modifiable aerial unit problem, the MAUP. So if, for example, if you change the boundaries of a statistical area, so the boundaries of neighborhoods, for example, what we experimented with Amsterdam dividing in 100 neighborhoods or in 1,000 neighborhoods or whatever you like. And if you calculate the level of segregation, then very different outcomes may result. And that is due to the simply creating different boundaries. Well, if you start with the individual, you don't have that. And you just develop individual neighborhoods where the individual is the center of the person's neighborhood. And that also tackles other problems. So the bespoke neighborhood, as they call it, can be developed. And if you have a lot of data and a lot of geography, you can think about exposure of individuals.
Sako, can you hear me?
Yeah.
5 minutes.
Yeah. Sorry?
5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. I will do that. Yeah. And so that individualization is highly important. You can also get rid of these kind of problems. So what I show you here is they call it a checkerboard problem, but these are neighborhoods, 16 neighborhoods. And so the values of the black squares in both cases are the same. So So in these 8 black left on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side, they have the same value, but they are arranged a little bit differently in the city. And but the outcome of the index of segregation, the D value in this case, or the dissimilarity value in both situations would be the same. Well, you can see intuitively that this is not a reality. But what we do with these individualized measures is creating a more realistic situation where you can get much more detail in how segregation situations look like in cities. This is, I would briefly want to talk about this a minute. This is a so-called local co-location quotient. This sounds difficult, but it is not. So you have heard about location quotients, where you look at the situation at the local level relative to the entire city, for example. Well, that's what you do here as well. But here I have just for each individual defined a similar type of neighborhood. That is, the neighborhood is defined as 220 neighbors around the individual. And then you look at the share. In this case, it's about Moroccans, and I would like to see how many Moroccans are living in an environment where they also have a lot of Moroccans around them. And so I looked at the share of Moroccans around them. And for each individual that was done, and then calculated that relative to the share in the city. So for example, in the city of Amsterdam, 10% of the population is Moroccan, has a Moroccan origin. But then I find individuals that have 40% of the individuals around them being Moroccan. And so that gives them a local co-location quotient of 4. And so I did that for each individual in Amsterdam, and then calculated all these values and plotted them. So these are all dots, all individuals. And then you can use other tools to make it a bit clearer. So cluster analysis, for example, to find clusters that are more or less similar. And then you can find different concentrations, different levels of segregation in different parts of the city. So it's much more rich in terms of information. And you don't talk about a segregated city, but you talk about segregation in some parts of the city. And if you do that, so you use the local location quotients, you can also do a lot of other things in research, because it's a piece of information for each individual. And so you can easily compare situations over the years. You could do that even at an individual level. And so this is an example of showing you the different situations where these individuals are finding themselves in. And you can also try to analyze changes over time. And so I found here, let's say, actually a situation of integration of Moroccans. So you see slowly over time, 2 processes. One is more balanced, in the direction of more balanced or integration, and simultaneously also a remaining part, which is still one of strong segregation. So net integration, but also some polarization. I will not talk about the effects of segregation, although that's a very interesting and important field, but because of time, I would like to talk a minute on policies. So I will skip this. It's a bit technical, and so it takes too much time. The policies, well, there are, if I try to be short, so I try to follow the welfare regime classification initially to define policies. You can do that to some extent, but I also wanted to include populist policies, which are not connected to a certain welfare regime in particular. So they are actually not taking care much about a certain type of policy in that respect, I think. But if you look at different type of policies labeled as I do here, you can reason, and you can also start to understand what will happen with the level of segregation. And so I found that all of these three types of policy views create segregation. Neoliberal policies, they stimulate a lot of individual choice and create, because of that, a lot of segregation as well, I must say. The social democratic type of policies are often aimed at social mixing. And so although their ideas were quite, let's say, sound and maybe also aimed at reducing segregation and increasing integration of people, this is not what a lot of people want. And so if you give people freedom to act, then they still try to find some segregation. And so there is still also segregation developing under social democratic and redistributing regimes. And the populists, actually, they are creating the most segregation, in my view, because they are blaming categories, and they are especially migrants, but also the neighborhoods where they are living in, and they create distance in a way. They create certain, well, distance, social distances in all respects, which are creating also more segregation. I have more more information in the book on that, much more actually, and also about the type of policies that are there, and so there is a lot to say about that. I can't go into that, but you will have to be aware of certain dominant framings that are creating actually inequality and creating stigmatization, discrimination, negative reputations of people. And so I mentioned three of these, which is well known almost everywhere. So there is policy about spreading the burden. We have called that in a book we wrote a long time ago, which is very negative to migrants. Already the title of the book tells it, but it's also the type of policy that tells it. And so it has very negative and stigmatizing, discriminating effects. Social mixing policy is also has these characteristics and also some other negative effects related to helping gentrification instead of the other way around. And then the anti-ghetto policies that are there nowadays in various contexts, while you actually can't find ghettos. So if you define segregation situations in a proper way, you will figure that out. And so I also wrote about it in the book quite a lot. I skipped that because it's too much. And I skipped this as well. So I would like to finalize with a couple of challenges, I think. So conceptual challenges, there are quite a lot of them. And so the improper use of the ghetto concept is one of them. I think homogeneity, the homogeneity tendency is a very strong one. And in all kind of societies, this is happening. Also in social democratic societies, people with a somewhat higher income still try to find homogeneous situations for themselves at the micro level. So maybe you can, there's nothing wrong with it until a certain level, you could say. So if you reach a certain level of homogeneity, and there is a large scale area homogeneity developing for different population categories, then you can expect processes of estrangement. And if that would happen, then you have real trouble in your city. So it is problematic. And so that behavior is, in a way, although it's liberal, it is problematic at the same time. So there are a lot of things are there on the research agenda to figure out what kind of things would work. I've thought myself about trying to socially engineer urban areas where you have where you accept homogeneity at the micro level, but do not accept it at a macro or meso level, and try to arrange different small homogeneous milieus together in larger heterogeneous milieus to avoid that kind of estrangement processes. But the research agenda is still quite open in that respect. Well, a lot of things I think I've addressed already. Integrated theory, micro level, longitudinal research, and so the questions remain for how you can translate that to planning, housing, all kind of policies that are strictly related to segregation processes, obviously. So I would like to leave it here. Maybe you have got the information, so it's also advertising on book, not to earn about it, but to tell you that the book normally are quite expensive, but this one, and especially for this occasion, is only costing you £10. If you use a discount code, you can do that till the end of the month. If you go to the Edward Elgar's website and to this book, you can get a book for that amount of money, which is, I think, reasonable.
Thanks a lot, Sako.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Also for the discount code.
Okay.
Everybody would like to get it. It's a really good opportunity if you are interested in the topic. I would immediately start with the discussants because we are slightly over time. So Costanzo, if you would like to start, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can
yes.
you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm not an expert in segregation, so I wonder why you asked me to discuss the excellent book of Sako, but I am a user of segregation techniques and segregation concepts. So, and so my opinion and my comments will come from this side. Generally speaking, I think that the book that we are discussing today is really excellent. I recommend this to all the people attending this meeting, and also I will recommend this also to my students. They are students in planning, as Yuri already said, but I think that they could enjoy a lot and learn a lot from this kind of book. Is a book, is an advanced introduction, is targeted, explicitly targeted to students, to early scholars, early career scholars, and also new people coming to the field, people who are not expert in segregation, but they need to know about this. And I think that the most important aspect of this book is that the book is very clear. It's very clean, I would say. So when you go through the different arguments, the different topics, you get exactly what Sako wants to give you or want to suggest to you. It's very, very, very clear. And at the same time, it's very informative. And what I like the most is that it's really evidence-based. So every time theory and concept are also discussed looking at the empirical evidence that we have about this, which is very important because sometimes we have discussions and talks about the segregation, which are not always so clearly evidence-based. And here, I think this book provides us with not only the evidence, but also the idea that we need to work with evidence and try to find every time I would say, circularity between our theoretical thoughts and the empirical findings, confirming or not confirming or inspiring new ideas about what we are studying. Okay. So my comments are, I will develop 3 comments, basically, trying to be very, very short. And there are more maybe questions also for Sako and for all of us, trying to investigate what could be the issues which are maybe not 100% solved in the Sako's book, which are still open, which are supposed to become important also in the next years. And some of my comments will be in some way also, I would say, contradictory. So I will try to clarify my ideas. The first one is about the relevance of the issue, the relevance of segregation. Because in a world, in a society which is more and more individualized, especially in the contemporary city context, in the megalopolis concepts, in the city region concepts, of course, the role played by neighborhoods or the role played by the local area becomes less relevant, maybe less relevant than in the past. Not for all the people, of course. For some people, as also Sako explained very well in the book, neighborhood level, the local space, the local context is still very important, even maybe more than in the past. But for many people, middle-class people, most of the people living in this kind of urban environment, neighborhood is not so relevant. So the people go and live in a place, and no matters the kind of people living around them. They have no link. They have no any connection with the people living close by. So in this kind of highly individualized settings, we need to maybe try to understand better what is the role played by segregation trends, segregation dynamics. Putting this very shortly, I would say that in this kind of context, segregation is more an outcome of socioeconomic inequalities, socioeconomic dynamics, than a factor contributing to exacerbate or temperate socioeconomic inequalities. So, of course, the place, as Sako also showed very well in the last part of his presentation today, it is very clearly also showed in the book, the people choose the place where they live in some way according to some criteria. This is clear. But my question is the other one. To what extent the place where the people live, the resident place, still affects other aspects of the people's lives and the social life in itself. So I think this is the one important aspect in order just to understand what is the relation between segregation, inequalities, and urban trends. And I think that one of the interesting things is that it may be that in this urban, highly individualized context, the residence area, the context of residence of people, the place where the people live, matters less than the place where the people spend most of the time. For example, workplace. For example, school. For example, meeting places. So it may be that these other demands that also Sako mentioned and also explored in the book are today increasingly relevant to understand the role played by segregation in everyday urban life. So it could be that school segregation, workplace segregation, segregation taking place in the labor market, segregation taking place in the access to welfare services, segregation related to the place where the people meet together, which is not necessarily related to the place where the people live, are today more important than the segregation taking place in residence areas, in the place where the people basically sleep. Okay, so it's an open question, but I think that the exploration of a multiple domains of segregation and the connection between these different domains is today a very important challenge for future analysis of segregation. The second comment is later what I learned from my students in planning. Because there is an interesting scheme in the book of Sako, I think this is page 26, if I remember well, in which he provides a kind of concept about what segregation is, or how we can conceptualize and analyze segregation. And he basically identified two different criteria. One is distinctiveness, to what extent the people are distinct from other categories. The second one is concentration. From my students, I learned that there is a third aspect, which is very important, which is separation. To what extent the people are separated, specific categories of people, maybe living in an area, or not living, but using specific services, for example, school, are separated from other people, because living in the same place or working or spending time in the same place does not necessarily mean that people do not have relationship with people living, working, studying in other places. So separation is important, and separation is also inherent the etymology of the word, because segregation is a Latin word which comes from segregare, which means taking some of a sheep out of a flock. So the physical separation between people, between sheep, between students isn't very important. And this important also because this tells us something about the role played by space, the physical space in building, in constructing segregation. For example, distance, physical distance, barriers, physical barriers, symbolic barriers, which can be highlighted also by the characteristic of a space. If we go back to research about ghettos areas, about segregated areas, we always find the role played by physical objects or physical barriers in building up segregation and separation between different groups of people. So this is something that maybe should be added to the book. So more attention paid to the space aspect. The last comment, and then I'm going to finish now, is about policies. I think that the idea of, there is one important idea which is in the book of Sako. I think that Sako didn't have a time to develop this in his presentation today, but we can discuss it a little bit with him later, if there is time, is that mainly segregation, anti-segregation policies, they were developed into social mix strategies. And Sako is skeptical about the capacity of these policies to really contrast segregation on the one hand. On the other hand, he says something more, that in some contexts, social mix strategy can be the way, can have opposite outcomes in respect of what is supposed to be the positive aspect of these policies. So it's aspirating segregation and also destroying solidarity between the people living in specific areas, for example. Okay, I agree with him. I think this is an important statement. I think this is an interesting perspective on this kind of policies. On the other side, I think that when we consider distress area, ghetto areas where segregation is related to the poorest people, or people who are separated from the rest of society, also in terms of employment, in terms of education, and so on and so forth. In this situation, of course, policies in some way addressing the problem of this area are still very important, as crucial. So, in these areas, this is the most important aspect. The main issue is not segregation in itself. It's the concentration of poor people, is poverty, is marginality of these people, is the fact that maybe the area is full of violence, of crime activities. These are the most important aspects. And the sense that most of the time policies are trying in social mix do not address the real problems which are evident, which are important in these areas. So I would say something more than what Sako said. Not only that social mix strategies are not always very important, but also that in some way they miss what is the real problem that has to be tackled in these areas. And I would have more things to say, but I think that's enough on my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Costanzo. I would immediately go to Szymon so that we can bundle the comments. Then we open up the discussion.
Okay, I mean, can you hear me? Yeah, I assume you can. Okay, so I'm not going to repeat Costanzo's comments. I mean, suffice it to say, I like the book very much and I read it with great interest. However, I'm also aware that, working on an introduction, even if it is an advanced introduction, you always have to be a bit selective. Plus, I guess, as all segregation scholars or social scholars in general, we have hobby horses of ours when it comes to theories, methods, and stuff. So I will, and time is flying like hell. So I will concentrate maybe on 2 points of Sako's book, and I will just raise some comments. These will be points 4 and 5, which is theory and methodology. And when it comes to theory, actually, I just having read Sako's book, I went through my last paper on socioeconomic segregation in Poland, and actually I realized that that the theory section was pretty much structured in the same way. However, I also studying immigrant segregation or racial ethnic segregation in Europe, in Sweden, well, in different countries. I just realized that that I'm afraid that although I very much like this meta-theoretical framework, if you don't mind, with this like individuals, institutions, and context, like let's call it the holy trinity of segregation factors, or those that shape segregation. I think that we should be, and it might be actually important for the youngsters in the classroom and those who want to study segregation, in the future, that perhaps we should actually fine-tune our theoretical frameworks to explain socioeconomic segregation and immigrant, racial, ethnic segregation. I mean, just in doing so, I mean, we can still use the framework. However, just going through Sako's books, I just realized that where are the references, to assimilation theory, segmentation theory, segmented assimilation theory, you name it. I mean, they all work very well, in explaining, or they were presented, as theories explaining immigrant segregation, and I think we shouldn't simply dump them off, because they can still be pretty useful. Plus, when we talk, just in short, when we talk about those grand theories, when we talk about institutions, right, that shape segregation, I think that according to Alba and Fonder, there might be some grand factors, if you name them, or grand narratives that are actually applicable to study immigrant native segregation. This would be, for instance, religion, immigration history, and some other factors. Whereas, like welfare state and housing regimes, I'm not sure. Well, I would like to learn Sako's opinions how he treats housing regimes in his theory. I know some people treat it as a wobbling pillar of the welfare state, but still, I mean, if I remember correctly, Sonia Arbaci actually disentangles the two, and she distinguishes between different effects of those two aspects. So I think that maybe we shouldn't leave, like the Kemenist narrative of dual and unitary regimes. I think that those issues might still be pretty useful. Plus, I think that what could be a bit more developed in this introduction is actually the role of the housing market itself, especially like the relation between population dynamics in the city and the dynamics of the real estate market. I mean, especially issues such as the relation between the demand and the supply side. I mean, it actually, according to Tara Watson, I mean, it is important. It is an important issue in the US, whether a residential market is flexible, whether it is not flexible, whether there is more supply than demand, and so on and so forth. So actually, it also turned out to be pretty important factor in Poland when it comes to explaining different intensity of segregation or levels of segregation, if you may. So this would be these theories, and so the first comment concerns maybe fine-tuning the theoretical frameworks to for different domains of segregation. These were dimensions. Okay, dimensions. The dimensions are a different story. When it comes also, for example, when it comes to demography, I mean, I very much like stress on age and on the effect of age on segregation. But what I miss is the issue of mixed marriages or mixed households. And if we assume that segregation is a continuous phenomenon, one that stretches from the body or household to the whole planet, then actually I think that then studying mixed marriages, if you want, between different ethnic groups or mixed households, actually from our studies, longitudinal studies on integration of newly arrived immigrants in Sweden. We actually followed 3 cohorts for 10 years. It seems actually that what really matters, and it might be interesting for those of you who consider migration to a different country, especially to a country where they do not use your mother tongue. I guess from our research, one of the most important factors, just contributing to integration in the residential domain and in the workplace domain was a native partner, at least in Sweden, which is pretty simple. I guess Sweden, well, if I remember correctly, I mean, don't kill me, I'm not a historian, but I mean, Sweden didn't have its own colonies, so it was difficult, to spread the language. So people coming to Sweden, they don't speak Swedish. If they have a partner, they learn the language, and their chances for integration increase. Okay, so this would be theory. I mean, there are other issues, but I guess I can leave them for the moment. And the other is actually measurement of segregation. And then again, I mean, what I would like to stress is as much as segregation is a continuous phenomenon when it comes to its spatial dimension, right? I mean, it's pretty much stretches, if you want, from the body, or expands from the body to the whole planet. It is also segregation is a continuous process. I mean, as we can study every year, right? In this sense, I mean, most segregation studies are actually, okay, I mean, Sako mentioned, the use of registers and stuff in those countries that are lucky enough to have such registers, in countries that actually that rely on censuses, right? This would be, I mean, measurement of segregation will be done every 10 years, right? When every census round. And nowadays, more and more scholars assume that it's a continuous process. We should measure it every year because there are simply different dynamics. Segregation within that, it can increase, increase, decline, and perhaps increase again. So, and there would be different methods used to study that. For instance, social sequence analysis, that is also more and more popular method in segregation research. And I especially, and I guess it might be also important for people who would like to study segregation and are younger, well, younger than me. I'm 47 and I've been studying segregation for the last 20 years. Would be, like new data sources. Actually, I found this in Sako's book, New Analytical Opportunities. And indeed, I mean, longitudinal data are one, longitudinal methods and data are one thing. But I think what we also should pay attention to are completely new data sources. And I think that there could be super attractive for especially for younger generation. Those who are very familiar with how do you call it, all those social platforms. There are excellent papers on studying immigrant or ethnic racial segregation using tweets in New York in native tags. So there is a very nice map of Manhattan, right? The other would be using mobile phone positioning data. But actually, I'm still, well, I co-worked with the University of Tartu, and they seem to be obsessed with this mobile phone data. Of course, I mean they are better, they are worse, but I mean they seem to love it, of course. And the last thing is actually, and this is something that that blew my mind. Like some time ago, I read a really good paper by Gebru. Okay, it was a very technical paper on the use of deep neural networks, but what they did was again mind-blowing. They used Google Street View. They prepared a table with 2,000 cars and their, and their market price. So they used Google Street View for every, batch, for every picture. They actually, we have 2 Honda Accords, 2 Chryslers. So, okay, this is the amount of money they could, they cost. So people living there should be, the average income of this neighborhood should be this and that. Bam. And they done it. They trained their neural network, and it was accurate in 92%. So they just concluded, okay, we don't need national censuses, to estimate income of neighborhoods. I mean, we can use, Google Street View. And actually, I'm doing that because I have and I especially decided, to raise this issue because of young generation. I have a young PhD student. He's very much into deep neural networks. So he shows me this stuff. We can use this. We can use that. So I mean, so the last thing, which would be quite interesting, is the new technology. And if I remember correctly, with ChatGPT, actually, which is like the label for artificial intelligence and deep neural networks, I think that there should be something we should keep in mind, that there will be new theories, or maybe not new theories, but new methods, and especially original data sources that we can that we can use to study segregation. Thanks. I'm not going to bother you anymore.
Thanks really a lot. I would open up the floor before giving the word to Sako, because we are a bit ahead of time. So if there are questions in the audience or questions in the classroom, I would urge you to raise your hand, either digitally or physically. Ask your question, and then we will give Sako a few minutes to answer, both to the comments by the discussants and your own questions. Don't feel shy, go ahead. And Szymon, if you can send us with paper, I think that would be fun to read. Thanks. The one of deep neural networks. There was some hilarity here in the classroom. Everybody seemed very interested. So there must be a generational issue there, definitely. So, okay, if there are no questions, maybe we could go back to Sako, and if you would like to react to the comments and issues raised by the 2 discussants, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you also for the comments, Costanzo and Szymon. Interesting observations, and also helpful, I think. So there are always things to be learned from the 2 of you as well, of course. I just will go briefly through the comments and questions that were raised, and start with Costanzo's comments. So one of the things that he asked about was actually the relevance of segregation. Why is it a relevant thing? And I think that's a basic question where I also started with in the book, actually, in chapter 2, where I go into you could say the epistemology of the matter, and talked a lot about the why question. So why would we pay attention to segregation? I think I already referred to it briefly. One of the big reasons to do so is that a lot of people, including politicians, certainly have a strong belief that segregation has very negative effects. So that's a very general answer, but this is an important reason to study segregation and to see how it evolves and how we can understand segregation, and also to think about when it is a real problem, because there you should start, actually. And but sorry. In any case, the sheer fact that a lot of people believe that there is a problem already invites to research segregation, to try to understand it, and also to see what kind of effects there are. And so these are the kind of things that I focused on, understanding and the effects. And you suggested that in any case, the local might be less relevant nowadays than it perhaps used to be. And the neighborhood is certainly more of less relevant. The middle class was suggested. I'm not so sure about that. I think the local is still very important for individuals, whatever status that they have, and also for middle class households, the local level. So the way, or the context where they are living in. So the neighbors that they have, the type of neighbor that they have is still very relevant for them. And that has a lot of relations. So one is, so just a few simple things that I can mention to illustrate this is that a lot of households are very keen on trying to get into residential situations where they can trust that their children are playing with children that have a similar background. So the similarity in terms of the children's attitudes, the schools that they are sent to, whatever. So that also stretches very much to the very local level. That's one thing. But another thing, a very different thing, is, for example, the value of the property that people have. So especially if you talk about middle class households, they want to be sure that they are settling in an environment where their own property is not negatively impacted upon by their environment. So they look for a similar type of middle class environment. But what we also see, and I gave you very briefly, I don't blame you about it, but I gave you the example of the share of people of the same lifestyle. So if that differs very much, then people are moving to another place where they go to places where it's more homogeneous, and so on. So the local level is still very, very, very important. And actually, the question that you asked was, does geography matter? Well, geography matters a lot, and especially at the micro level, but also at other levels. So it depends on what you're talking about. If you talk about, well, anyway, so that is so that homogeneity tendency of people, you can find it in terms of lifestyles, ethnicity, income, socioeconomic position, cultural position, you name it. And think it's very, very important. You can also see it in the cities. So the inner cities of the large cities nowadays, they are the domains of increasingly the domains of middle class households, smaller middle class households with a strong cultural orientation, and that is already telling that story as well. So that seems to be very important. I also must say that I understand your point that you say, well, is the residential dimension so important still, or domain important still, or is it much more the workplace or where you meet people, the school in particular? I think all is true. So the residential, the place to live matters for the reasons that I just gave you. So the place where children are growing up, investment status that it gives people. But the school is also extremely important. Segregation levels are therefore also a bit higher at school level. So school segregation levels are higher than residential levels, because that is even more important. I know, and in the literature it's also well known, that a lot of households say that they would like to live amidst other people, so in a mixed environment, to get more impulses, and that may be true in several respects. But if they send their children to school, they also say, and they explicitly, yeah, but I want my kid to the best school there is for that kid, and so the children are they have a very strong well, they express very strongly how much segregation minded also these middle class households who want to live perhaps in a mixed environment. Some of them want, but still at school it's much more oriented to homogeneity in school. And but I would say all of these domains are interesting and relevant to study. I study the physical. You talked about the importance of the physical separation from other people. Well, I think that is where geographers have focused on most, could almost say. So you try to express that in maps. And so when geographers talk about segregation, they often are kind of biased in the sense that they talk too much about the geography of segregation. Segregation is the separation of spaces where people live, where people work, where they go to, what they use in terms of transport. That is where it's all about. It's not the only thing, so you can also be segregated in society at large, indeed have segregated networks, but I think space is extremely important, and physical distance is also extremely important. That's also the reason why I think also middle class households still search for a certain homogeneity nearby, because they want to be assured that they are living in such a situation. The policies, well, social mix, you rightly said that can also destroy social networks. So if you force it too much, so there are quite some negative impacts of social mix. But you also said that the real problem is actually the concentration of poverty, or the concentration of violence, concentration of crime. But that is also related to the entire segregation question. So if you would just follow the Schelling's ideas, or the ideas of people themselves in a liberal context, and almost all European countries are now liberal societies. So if you leave it to the individual decision maker, that is also the developer on the supply side, and the builder, but also the households and the individuals on the demand side. then you will get a lot of homogeneity. But the homogeneity is for the strongest. They can afford to do that most. So ultimately, they will lock themselves in gated communities. But what they leave behind is also a kind of selective community, which is for the poor who do not have that choice, and that is for the poor. So the middle class and the affluent, by their behavior, they are segregating most. I already said, and they do that everywhere. But what they leave behind is also a segregated situation of the concentration of poverty. So they are connected to each other, and also violence and crime is the same story. So they will try to get out of situations of crime and violence, and they can afford the middle class, but they leave behind a situation of concentration of crime. So it's all in the same game. Quickly to Szymon's comment, I agree that you should also pay a lot of attention to racial or ethnic or migrant segregation. I try to do it in a balanced way. Maybe I talked a bit more about socioeconomic positions, but that's also, I think, maybe deeply it has to do with the fact that so there are populist and popular debates about migrants that disturb the order or that have a negative impact on the existing identities of certain groups and so on. But I think that is only a minority. It is a minority, an important minority, and it is also important in the discussion. But what I mean to say is that most of the migrants where we are talking about they will be exposed to similar kind of problems as others as well. So they are discriminated, and that should get attention. And that can become thinner and less when they marry with a non-co-ethnic, so to say. But and it may get attention, but I think the real problem for migrants to integrate is through the labor market and education. And so these things I also have given attention, by the way, in this book as well, and talk about populist politicians that only want, if they allow people to get in anyway, they only allow assimilation one-sided, whereas there always has been a kind of double-sided dynamic in a way in terms of identities, culture, and so on. So I think that you should pay attention to it, but it's also about how they get access to a good position in education, in the labor market, and then you are talking about similar things again, I believe. The measurement. Finally, the measurement. I was indeed happy to be able to use very rich register data. And you should not forget, I think there are other ways to measure things, and there are also sexy measurement things. So you mentioned actually one. So if you talk about neural networks or using mobile data to describe income segregation, or the Google Maps or the information that Google gives you on cars and streets, you can use that also to give a kind of socioeconomic position of these streets. But what you should not forget that the actual progress in research, in my view, is not by just the description of segregation in one way or another. But you are definitely in need of a lot of other dimensions and variables. And so these register data, they are so rich. So they combine all the registers. So I do not only know about income and income segregation, but also know their ethnic background, where they come from, their household careers, their labor careers, their health situation, and so on. So, and all of that is needed in research to make progress, to get to a better understanding. So often the fashionable ways of describing things, they only focus on a few variables. And mobile telephone data, how sexy they are, is very limited. So you know at best the language they speak, the address that they get the bill sent to, and well, maybe 3 or 4 other things, but very limited in my view, structurally. Thanks a lot.
Thanks really a lot for this very comprehensive overview on segregation. Thanks also to the two discussants who added nuances to the understanding of this complexity behind the concept and the process. Unfortunately, we have to close the session because we are already over time. But I would like to thank you very much and to suggest everybody to read the book. And we also distributed the paper on the fancy methods, but keeping in mind what Sako just said about it's important also to have a theoretical understanding of what the data produces. So that's a very important point. And we will reconvene in this series online on the 24th of April with the presentation of a book by Sako Musterd and Jenny Robinson about the Handbook on Comparative Global Urban Studies. And up to then, thanks to everybody and enjoy the rest of the day. So,
okay, thank you. I can tell you that if there is someone who wants to ask a question later on, just ask me by email.
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.